The flames cast their final glow against the Montana sky as Abigail Vincent clutched her father's pocket watch, the only possession she'd managed to save. Tears streamed down her ash-stained face as she watched 18 years of memories crumble into embers. It was 1876, and at 22 she stood utterly alone, orphaned by consumption the previous winter and now homeless as lightning had turned her family ranch to cinders. "Miss, you can't stay out here all night," a deep voice said from behind her. Abigail whirled around, startled by the tall figure silhouetted against the darkening landscape. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she recognized him as Ethan Evans, a rancher whose property bordered her father's land to the west. "I have nowhere else to go, mister." "Evans," she replied, drawing herself up despite the tremor in her voice. Pride was all she had left. Ethan stepped closer, and the dying firelight revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, but kind eyes that reflected genuine concern. At 30, he'd built a respectable spread after arriving in the territory 5 years earlier. Folks said he kept to himself, more comfortable with horses than people. "My foreman's cabin is empty. It's not much, but it'll keep you dry tonight." He gestured toward his horse. "We should go before it gets any darker. Coyotes will be drawn to the smoke." Abigail hesitated. She barely knew Ethan Evans beyond polite nods when their paths crossed in town. Her father had spoken well of him, calling him a fair man who minds his business, high praise from Jonathan Vincent. "I couldn't impose," she said, though the thought of spending the night alone in the open filled her with dread. "It's no imposition, can't leave a neighbor in trouble." His voice was matter of fact but gentle. "Besides, your father helped me when I first arrived. Consider it repaying a debt." Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the decision for her. With one last glance at the smoldering ruins of her home, Abigail nodded and allowed Ethan to help her onto his horse. She sat side saddle in front of him, acutely aware of his solid presence at her back as they rode west, away from everything she had ever known. The foreman's cabin was indeed modest, a single room with a narrow bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small cook stove. But it was clean and dry, and when Ethan lit the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam, it felt almost welcoming. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, will bring you some clothes tomorrow," he said, standing awkwardly by the door after showing her how to work the stove. "There's coffee and some basic provisions in the cupboard. I'll have one of the hands bring firewood before morning." "Thank you," Abigail said, the enormity of her situation finally hitting her as she stood in this stranger's cabin. "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "No need for that talk," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Get some rest, Miss Vincent. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her father's watch, and finally allowed herself to truly weep for all she had lost. Morning came with soft rain against the cabin roof and a knock at the door. Abigail, who had barely slept, quickly smoothed her rumpled dress and opened the door to find a short, stout woman with silver-streaked black hair holding a bundle of clothing. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I presume?" Abigail said. "She, señorita. Mr. Evans sent me with these." She handed over the bundle. "My daughter was about your size before she married and moved to Colorado. These should do until we can get you properly outfitted." "That's very kind, but I can't accept." "You can and you will," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly, bustling past Abigail into the cabin. "The good Lord tests us all, but he never intended us to face trials alone. Now, have you eaten?" Before Abigail could answer, Mrs. Rodriguez was unpacking a basket filled with fresh bread, cheese, and preserves. The older woman's efficient kindness brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what I would have done if Mr. Evans hadn't found me." "That man has a good heart beneath that quiet manner," Mrs. Rodriguez said, pouring coffee from a small pot she'd brought. "Now eat, then change. Mr. Evans will be by later to discuss matters." "Matters?" Abigail asked. "Your situation, child. Winter's coming in a few months. You need more than temporary shelter." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Abigail changed into the borrowed clothing, a simple blue calico dress that was slightly loose but clean and whole. She was washing her face when another knock came at the door. Ethan Evans stood outside, looking more approachable in daylight despite his imposing height. He held his hat in his hands, revealing thick brown hair in need of a trim. "Miss Vincent," he said with a nod. "How are you faring this morning?" "Better, thanks to your kindness," she replied, stepping back to invite him in. He entered cautiously, as if worried about intruding on her space, though the cabin was technically his property. "I've been thinking," he said, standing near the door while she sat at the table. "Your land, it's good grazing property. Your father ran a respectable operation before his passing." Abigail nodded, grief washing over her anew at the mention of her father. "The thing is," Ethan continued, "without the house or barn, and with winter coming in a few months, it would be hard for you to rebuild in time." "I know," she said quietly. Her father's modest savings had been kept in a tin box in his desk, now nothing but ash. "I suppose I could sell the land, though who would buy it without structures?" Ethan cleared his throat. "I would, for a fair price, but that's not what I came to suggest." Abigail looked up, curious. "I could help you rebuild, a cabin at least, before the snows come. It won't be like what you had before, but it would be yours." Abigail stared at him, astonished. "Why would you do that?" Ethan shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with explaining his motivations. "Like I said, your father helped me when I first came here, and—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "It's the right thing to do. Mr. Evans, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't accept such charity." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "I'm proposing an arrangement. I could use help with the books for my ranch. Mrs. Rodriguez tells me you're good with figures. Your father mentioned it once too." Abigail was surprised her father had spoken of her to this man. "Yes, I kept the accounts for our ranch." "Then it's settled. You'll help with my accounts and I'll help you rebuild. A fair exchange." It wasn't really fair. Building a cabin required far more labor than keeping ledgers, but Abigail recognized the offer for what it was. A chance to maintain her independence without wounding her pride. "When would we start?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll come by at first light." True to his word, Ethan arrived just as dawn broke the next day, leading a wagon loaded with tools and accompanied by two ranch hands who tipped their hats respectfully to Abigail before beginning to unload the wagon. "I thought we'd survey your land first," Ethan said, offering Abigail his hand to help her into the wagon. "Pick a good spot for the new cabin." The ride to her property was quiet. Abigail found that Ethan wasn't one for idle conversation, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. When they reached her land, he stopped the wagon well before the blackened remains of her family home. "We don't need to go there," he said gently, noticing her gaze fixed on the distant ruins. "Best to start fresh." They spent the morning walking the property, with Ethan pointing out potential building sites, explaining the merits of each: proximity to water, shelter from winter winds, drainage during spring thaws. His knowledge was impressive, and Abigail found herself genuinely interested in his explanations. "What about there?" she finally suggested, indicating a slight rise near a stand of pines with a clear view of the mountains to the west. "The sunrise would come through the front door and the sunset would light up the whole place." Ethan studied the spot, then nodded. "Good choice. Solid ground, natural windbreak, enough clearing for a small garden come spring." He looked at her with new respect. "Your father taught you well." "He believed a woman should understand the land as well as any man," Abigail said, remembering her father's patient lessons. "Smart man," Ethan replied. "Let's mark it out." The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Mornings, Abigail would ride with Ethan to her land where they worked on the cabin. In the afternoons, she would return to the foreman's cabin to work on Ethan's ranch accounts, discovering that while his operation was modest compared to some, it was meticulously run and turning a steady profit. Abigail soon realized that Ethan Evans was a man who let his actions speak for him. He rarely talked about himself, but she learned more from watching him work than she might have from hours of conversation. He was patient with his horses, firm but fair with his men, and when he gave his word, it was as solid as the foundation stones they laid for her cabin. "You're not what I expected," she admitted one afternoon as they sat in the shade during a brief rest, drinking water from a shared canteen. "Oh," Ethan raised an eyebrow, wiping sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "People in town call you a loner, some even say you're standoffish." He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "People talk, I just prefer action to words." "I've noticed," she said, finding herself smiling back, "but you're easy to be around even when you're quiet." A flush that wasn't from the heat crept up his neck, and he stood abruptly. We should get back to work if we want that roof on before sundown. As the cabin took shape, so did Abigail's appreciation for Ethan. He had a craftsman's hands, capable of both the brute strength needed to notch logs and the delicate precision required for fitting a door frame. By the fourth week, the walls were up and they began work on the roof. One evening, as Abigail was finishing the day's accounting, a thunderstorm broke over the valley. Lightning flashed, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made her jump, spilling ink across the ledger. The sight of the spreading dark stain instantly transported her back to the night of the fire, and she found herself trembling uncontrollably. A knock at the door barely registered through her panic, but then Ethan was there, rain-soaked and concerned. Abigail. I saw the light still burning and thought, he stopped, taking in her distress. What's wrong? The storm, she managed, hating how weak she sounded. The lightning it reminded me of understanding dawned in his eyes. Without hesitation, he crossed the room and sat beside her, taking her ink-stained hands in his larger ones. You're safe, he said simply. I promise. Something in his steady gaze anchored her, and gradually her breathing steadied. They sat like that, hands joined, until the storm passed. I'm sorry, she finally said. I don't usually fall apart like that. Don't apologize for feeling, he replied. Then, as if embarrassed by his own words, he released her hands and stood. I'll check on you tomorrow. But the next day brought a change. Ethan seemed more guarded, keeping a careful distance as they worked. Abigail caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't decipher, but when she met his gaze, he would quickly look away. Have I offended you? She finally asked as they were breaking for lunch. No, he said, looking genuinely surprised. Why would you think that? You've hardly spoken 10 words today, and you keep looking at me like I'm a puzzle you can't solve. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I'm not good with words, Abigail, especially around, he stopped, frowning. Around what? Around you, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. You make me want to say things I don't know how to say. The simple honesty of his confession touched something deep within her. You don't always need words, Ethan, sometimes actions are enough. His eyes met hers then, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might reach for her, but instead he nodded once and turned back to his work. That evening, as Abigail returned to the foreman's cabin, she found a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a silver comb for her hair, simple but beautiful, with delicate engravings of wildflowers. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. The gift spoke volumes about the giver, practical yet thoughtful, sturdy but with unexpected beauty in the details, just like Ethan himself. The cabin progressed rapidly after that. Ethan brought in more hands to help, and by early September, it was nearly complete, a sturdy one-room structure with a stone fireplace, solid wooden floor, and 2 windows that caught the light just as Abigail had imagined. It was simple but sound, built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. It's perfect, Abigail said, standing in the doorway and taking in the cabin that would be her new home. I never thought I'd have a home again after the fire. It's not quite done, Ethan said, pointing to the area near the fireplace. Still need shelves there, and the roof needs another layer of sealant before the snow flies. But it's mine, she said softly, something that can't be taken away. Ethan's expression grew serious. Abigail, I've been meaning to talk to you about your land, her heart sank. Despite their growing friendship, perhaps he still intended to buy her out. What about it? She asked guardedly. I've been thinking. Your father ran about 60 head of cattle before he fell ill, right? She nodded, uncertain where this was leading. Well, you've got good grazing land, but starting over with a herd takes capital, and running cattle alone is hard work, especially for a woman, she challenged. For anyone, he corrected gently. I was thinking we might consider a partnership. I've got extra stock I could move onto your land. We'd share the profits and I'd provide the hands to help with the work. A partnership? The concept surprised her. Not an offer to buy. This land is your legacy, Abigail. I wouldn't ask you to part with it, but working together could benefit us both. The proposal was sound from a business perspective, but Abigail sensed there was more to it than economics. The way Ethan looked at her as he spoke, the careful way he said partnership, it carried weight beyond a simple business arrangement. I'd need time to consider it, she said. Of course. He nodded, looking relieved that she hadn't immediately rejected the idea. There's no rush. The cabin needs finishing first anyway. That night, alone in the foreman's cabin that had been her temporary sanctuary, Abigail found herself thinking not about the business proposition, but about the man who had made it. In the weeks they'd worked together, Ethan had become more than a neighbor or benefactor. She'd come to value his quiet strength, his integrity, and the rare moments when his serious demeanor would crack to reveal a dry humor that never failed to make her smile. The next morning, she arrived at her new cabin to find Ethan already there, installing shelves beside the fireplace. "I thought these might hold your books and whatnot," he explained, stepping back to show her his work. "Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned you like to read." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, remembering such a small detail about her preferences, touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wooden shelf. "My father's library was lost in the fire. Just a few volumes, but I miss them." "What sort of books?" he asked, surprising her with the question. Ethan rarely initiated conversations, mostly practical things: farming, almanacs, animal husbandry, but there were novels too. Dickens was my father's favorite, mine as well. "I have a copy of David Copperfield," Ethan said, focusing intently on adjusting the level of the shelf. "You're welcome to borrow it. You read Dickens?" She couldn't hide her surprise. He glanced up, a hint of defensiveness in his expression. "I may not have had much formal schooling, but I can appreciate good writing." "I didn't mean to imply, I know," he said, his expression softening. "Truth is, I've always found books easier company than most people, until recently, that is." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Abigail felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the early autumn sun streaming through the cabin window. The moment was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Rodriguez, who came bearing a basket of provisions for Abigail's new home. "So this is where you'll be setting up housekeeping," the older woman said approvingly as she surveyed the cabin. "It's a fine job, Mr. Evans." "Abigail helped design it," Ethan said. "She's got a good eye for what works." Mrs. Rodriguez looked between them with a knowing smile. "Indeed. Well, I've brought some essentials to get you started, Miss Vincent. Linens, cooking utensils, and such." As the older woman began unpacking her basket, Ethan excused himself to check on the men who were finishing the roof. "That man," Mrs. Rodriguez said once he was out of earshot, "has changed since you arrived." "What do you mean?" Abigail asked, arranging the dishes Mrs. Rodriguez had brought on the new shelves. "In the 5 years I've worked for Mr. Evans, I've never seen him talk so much or smile so often. He used to spend evenings alone on the porch, just staring at the mountains. Now he's always working on something for this cabin or asking me what a young woman might need to be comfortable." Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "He's been very kind." "Kind, yes. But it's more than kindness that brings a man to cut fresh wildflowers for the table of a woman who isn't even there to see them yet. He did that yesterday, said the place needed brightening up before you moved in." Mrs. Rodriguez patted Abigail's hand. "Life is short, my dear. Especially out here. Don't waste time pretending not to see what's right in front of you." Later that day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly completed cabin, Abigail found Ethan alone, splitting wood for her woodpile. For a moment, she simply watched him, the fluid strength in his movements, the concentration on his face. When he paused to wipe his brow, he caught sight of her and straightened. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I can move in tomorrow," she said, approaching him. "The roof's done, everything's sound. You'll be comfortable here." He drove the axe into the chopping block and turned to face her fully. "It's a good, solid cabin, should serve you well." "Thanks to you," he shrugged off the compliment. "You earned it working on my accounts. They've never been so organized." Abigail took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your proposal." His expression grew very still. "And a partnership makes sense. My land, your cattle and expertise. It's a practical solution." "Practical," he echoed, and she thought she detected a note of disappointment in his voice. "But there's something I need to know first," she continued, gathering her courage. "What's that?" "Is it only a business arrangement you're proposing, Ethan?" The question hung between them in the golden afternoon light. Ethan's gaze never left hers, but she could see him struggling with how to respond. "No," he finally said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "It's not just business, not for me." Relief and joy flooded through her. Not for me either. He took a step toward her, then stopped, uncertainty written across his features. Abigail, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. I can't offer you the kind of life you might have had before. I don't want the life I had before, she interrupted gently. I want a life that's real. With someone who sees me as I am. I see you, he said simply, and in those 3 words was a depth of feeling that no flowery declaration could match. This time, when he moved toward her, there was no hesitation. His calloused hand came up to cup her cheek with surprising tenderness. May I? He asked, his eyes searching hers. In answer, Abigail rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, but then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteadily. I've wanted to do that since I found you standing in the ashes of your home, he confessed. You looked so fierce, even in your grief. I knew then you were something special. I thought you were just being kind. Kind, yes, but selfish too. Every day I spent with you made me want more days. More time to learn the sound of your laugh, the way your eyes change color depending on your mood. Abigail smiled, charmed by this unexpected poetry from a man who claimed to be no good with words. So this partnership, she said, twining her fingers with his. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Evans? A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression. Well, Miss Vincent, I'm proposing we join our lands, our herds, and our lives, if you'll have me. Are you asking me to marry you, Ethan Evans? In my clumsy way, yes. I love you, Abigail. I think I've loved you since that first morning when you stood in the ruins of your home and refused to let it break you. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. His kiss this time was filled with promise and a joy that neither had dared hope for when they first met amid the ashes of her old life. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the town's small church. It was a simple affair, Abigail in a new blue dress that Mrs. Rodriguez had helped her make, Ethan in his best shirt and string tie, looking both terrified and elated as she walked down the aisle toward him. The entire town turned out to witness the union, curious to see the reserved Ethan Evans take a bride, and moved by the story of how they had found each other. Reverend Thomas spoke of Phoenix rising from ashes, of new beginnings, and of the mysterious ways in which gods will manifested. But Abigail, standing hand in hand with Ethan, thought less about divine providence and more about the very human courage it took to rebuild after loss, the daily choice to move forward, to trust, to love again. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the town hall, with food contributed by neighbors and music provided by a local fiddler. Abigail was touched by the community's generosity, especially given that she had always felt somewhat of an outsider after her father's death. You've given them something to celebrate, Mrs. Rodriguez told her as they watched Ethan awkwardly accepting congratulations from townspeople he normally avoided. Hope is always worth celebrating. That night, Ethan brought her not to the foreman's cabin or to her new cabin, but to his own home, a 2-story house that was larger and more comfortable than she had expected for a bachelor's residence. I built it thinking of the future, he explained as he carried her over the threshold. Hoping someday it wouldn't just be me rattling around in here. The house was warm and welcoming, with solid furniture and unexpected touches of beauty hand-carved banisters on the staircase, colorful quilts in the bedroom, bookshelves lined with volumes that revealed a mind far more cultured than Ethan's rough exterior suggested. Our home, Abigail said, emotion welling up as she took in the space that would be the center of their new life together. Ours, he agreed, drawing her into his arms. Though I was thinking we might still use your cabin too. It's well placed for checking on the herd during calving season. And it's special, our first project together. I'd like that, she said, touched that he understood the cabin's significance to her. Their first weeks of marriage were a time of discovery. Abigail learned that Ethan rose before dawn every day out of habit, but would bring her coffee in bed before heading out to work. She discovered he had a surprising talent for cooking, though he claimed it was just bachelor survival skills. He learned that she sang to herself when she thought no one was listening, that she had a sharp mind for business beyond just keeping accounts, and that she wasn't afraid to argue her point when she believed she was right. They settled into a partnership that extended beyond their personal relationship to the running of their now combined ranch operations. Ethan respected Abigail's knowledge and instincts about cattle, often seeking her opinion on breeding stock or grazing rotations. She, in turn, admired his practical wisdom and willingness to innovate when traditional methods fell short. The first winter of their marriage tested their new life together. November brought early snows and bitter cold that lasted well into March. Cattle needed extra feed and constant monitoring. Days were short and work was hard. But in the evenings, they would sit before the fire in their home, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in companionable silence, building the foundations of a life together one quiet moment at a time. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a fire," Abigail admitted one night as they sat wrapped in a quilt before the hearth. "But if my home hadn't burned, we might never have found each other." Ethan pulled her closer. "I like to think we would have. Some things are meant to be, fire or no fire." Spring came late but gloriously, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and new calves strengthening the herd. Abigail threw herself into creating a vegetable garden beside the house, while Ethan expanded their operations, purchasing adjacent land from a neighbor returning east. By summer, their hard work was showing results. The ranch was prospering, their partnership both personal and professional growing stronger with each challenge they faced together. It was during these busy, satisfying months that Abigail realized she was expecting a child. She told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy and wonder, and a protective tenderness that manifested in his insistence that she reduce her workload, despite her protests that pregnancy wasn't an illness. "Humor me," he said, pulling her onto his lap. "I've just found this happiness. I want to protect it. By wrapping me in cotton wool," she teased. "If necessary," he replied, only half joking. As autumn painted the landscape in fiery hues once again, marking a year since the fire that had changed Abigail's life, she found herself drawn to visit the site of her childhood home. Ethan accompanied her, watchful and supportive as she stood where her family's house had once been. The blackened ruins were gone now, cleared away by time and the elements. New grass had sprouted and wildflowers nodded in the breeze. Nature had healed the scarred earth, just as time had healed her grief. "It's strange," she said, one hand resting on her growing belly. "I can still see it all so clearly in my mind: the parlor where my mother taught me to sew, the kitchen where my father would read aloud in the evenings. But standing here now, it feels like another life." "It was another life," Ethan said gently, "but that doesn't mean it wasn't real or important." She looked up at him, this man who had helped her build a new life from the ashes of the old. "I want to tell our child about this place, about my parents and the life I had here, but I also want them to know that sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning." Ethan's hand covered hers where it rested on her abdomen. "We'll make sure they know, and we'll make sure they understand that it's not the walls around you that make a home, it's the people you share it with." Their daughter, Emma, was born on a crisp December morning, arriving with the same determination that characterized both her parents. She had Ethan's serious eyes and Abigail's stubborn chin, and from her first cry she had both of them wrapped around her tiny fingers. "She's perfect," Ethan whispered, holding his daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for giving me a reason to begin again," Abigail replied, "for building more than just a cabin, for building a life with me." As Emma grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. They added onto the main house, built a larger barn, and increased their herd. Neighbors who had once viewed Ethan as a standoffish loner now sought his advice on breeding stock and land management. Abigail became known for her sharp business sense and generous community involvement, organizing the town's first lending library and serving on the school board. Their partnership in love, in parenting, in business became a model for the community, though neither of them sought such recognition. They were simply doing what came naturally, supporting each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses, and building something stronger together than either could have created alone. Emma's third birthday coincided with the completion of the town's new schoolhouse, a project Abigail had championed from inception to ribbon cutting. At the celebration, as Emma played with other children and Ethan chatted with neighbors who had become friends, Abigail found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the fullness of her life. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, noticing her sudden quiet. "More than all right," she assured him. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in 5 years, how much we've built together. And there's more to come," he said, a mysterious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, he took her hand and led her away from the crowd toward their wagon parked at the edge of the schoolyard. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her up onto the seat. "A surprise I've been working on." They rode out of town, not toward their ranch, but in the direction of Abigail's cabin, the first home they had built together. As they approached, Abigail gasped. Beside the cabin stood a new structure, a small barn with corral fencing extending from it. "What is this?" she asked as they pulled up before it. "Well," Ethan said, helping her down from the wagon, "I was thinking, Emma's getting older, soon she'll want to learn to ride, and maybe someday she'll have brothers or sisters who will too." The mention of more children made Abigail smile. They had been talking about expanding their family. "So," Ethan continued, leading her toward the barn, "I thought we might start a new venture, horses. Not just for ranch work, but for breeding and training, quality stock that could make a name for us beyond cattle." Inside the barn, 3 beautiful horses wickered softly in spacious stalls, a magnificent black stallion and 2 chestnut mares, all with the clean lines and intelligent eyes that marked superior breeding. "Ethan, they're beautiful," Abigail breathed, running a hand along the stallion's gleaming neck. "But where did they come from? How did you manage this without my knowing?" He smiled, pleased by her reaction. "Been planning it a while. That trip I took to Denver last month wasn't just for cattle business, and I had some help keeping the secret." He nodded toward the barn door where Mrs. Rodriguez stood with Emma, both of them beaming. "Horsies, Mama," Emma exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Papa says one for me too." "Not quite yet, little one," Ethan corrected gently. "But soon, when you're a bit bigger." Abigail felt tears welling up, tears of joy and gratitude for this man who continually found ways to surprise her, to build new dreams with her. "The cabin can be our base for the horse operation," Ethan explained. "Close enough to home, but separate enough to give the business its own identity. What do you think? Is it too much to take on?" "No," Abigail said confidently. "It's perfect, another new beginning." That evening, after Emma was tucked into bed, Abigail and Ethan sat on the porch of their main house, looking out over the land that had become the foundation of their shared life. "I have news too," Abigail said, taking his hand. "Emma will be getting that brother or sister sooner than we planned." "I'm expecting again." Ethan's face transformed with joy. "When?" "Late summer, according to Dr. Wilson." He gathered her into his arms, his happiness too great for words. They sat together in the gathering dusk, contemplating the future they continued to build together. "Who would have thought," Abigail mused, "that the worst day of my life would lead to all this happiness? That from such complete loss could come such abundance?" "Life has a way of surprising us," Ethan replied, his voice thoughtful. "When I came west, I was running from failure back east. My father's failed business, my own failed attempts to save it. I thought I'd spend my life alone out here, just me and the land and the cattle. And instead," he smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Instead, I found you standing in the ashes of your home, looking like you'd challenge the whole world if you had to. And I thought, there's a woman worth building something with." "And build we have," Abigail said, looking out at their ranch, the solid house, the well-maintained barns and corrals, the healthy cattle grazing on green pastures. "From the ground up." Their son, James, arrived in August, a sturdy, calm baby who rarely cried and watched the world with solemn curiosity. Emma, now almost 4, appointed herself his special guardian, singing him the songs Abigail had sung to her and reading to him from her picture books. The horse breeding business flourished under their joint management. Ethan had an eye for good stock and a way with even the most difficult animals. Abigail brought organization and business acumen, establishing their reputation through carefully targeted marketing and impeccable record-keeping. Within 2 years, Evan's horses were sought after throughout the territory for their intelligence, stamina, and even temperament. As their success grew, so did their family. Their third child, Grace, joined them when James was 3, completing their family with her sunny disposition and infectious laugh. Their home, once built for a solitary bachelor's future hopes, now rang with children's voices and the everyday sounds of a busy, loving family. The cabin where their journey had begun remained a special place for them. As the children grew, it became a retreat sometimes for the whole family during roundup or foaling season, sometimes just for Abigail and Ethan when they needed to reconnect amid the demands of ranch life and parenting. "It still amazes me," Abigail said one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors reminiscent of the fire that had once taken her home. "How something so good could come from something so tragic." "Life's like that sometimes," Ethan replied, his arm around her shoulders. "The worst moments can lead to the best if you're brave enough to keep going. We were brave together," she said, leaning into his embrace. "That made all the difference." As twilight deepened into night, they sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from ashes to abundance, from strangers to soulmates, from loss to a love that had built not just a cabin or a ranch, but a life rich with purpose and joy. The children were growing faster than either of them could believe. Emma, at 12, was already showing signs of the capable, intelligent woman she would become, helping with the horses, excelling at her studies, and mothering her younger siblings with a blend of bossiness and devotion that amused both her parents. James, at 8, was his father's shadow, soaking up everything Ethan could teach him about ranch work, horses, and the land. He had Ethan's quiet nature but Abigail's quick mind, often surprising them with observations that seemed beyond his years. Grace, their 5-year-old whirlwind, brought laughter wherever she went. Unlike her more serious siblings, she approached life as one grand adventure, her fearlessness both thrilling and terrifying her parents. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Ethan surprised Abigail by closing the cabin and barns to business for the day and arranging for Mrs. Rodriguez, now technically retired, but still very much part of their extended family, to watch the children. "A day just for us," he explained, helping Abigail into the buggy he'd had specially cleaned and decorated with wildflowers. "To remember where we started and celebrate how far we've come." He drove them to a spot overlooking both their properties, the original Evans Ranch and what had once been Vincent land, now seamlessly joined into one thriving operation. Spread out before them were green pastures dotted with cattle, the horse paddocks where their prize stock grazed, the barns and outbuildings that supported their work, and the 2 homes that anchored it all, the main house where they lived with their children, and the cabin that had been the first tangible sign of their shared future. A picnic hamper waited for them, filled with all of Abigail's favorite foods and a bottle of fine wine that Ethan must have special ordered from Denver. "This is wonderful," Abigail said as they spread the blanket on the grass. "But you know I would have been happy with just a quiet evening at home." "I know," he said, pouring the wine into 2 glasses. "That's one of the countless reasons I love you, but some occasions deserve marking in a special way." They ate and talked, reminiscing about the early days of their relationship and marveling at how their modest beginnings had flourished into such abundance. The ranch now employed 5 full-time hands in addition to their family's labor. Their horse breeding operation had gained national attention, with buyers coming from as far as California and New York. The town itself had grown around them, with Abigail's lending library evolving into a proper town library housed in its own building. "We've been blessed," Abigail said, leaning against Ethan's shoulder as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. "We have," he agreed, "but it wasn't just blessing, it was work and determination, mostly yours," she laughed. "Hardly. You're the one who built a cabin with your bare hands when all I had was ashes. And you're the one who built a future when all I had was a lonely existence and some cattle." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Abigail, these 10 years with you have been the best of my life. When I found you that night, standing in the ruins of your home, I had no idea I was also finding my heart." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes at the simple eloquence of his words. For a man who claimed not to be good with language, Ethan had always known exactly what to say when it mattered most. "I love you," she said, squeezing his hands. Not just for what you've given me or what we've built together, but for who you are, the man who sees me clearly and loves me completely. Always, he promised, sealing the word with a kiss that held the same tenderness and passion as their first. As they drove home in the gathering dusk, Abigail thought about the path that had brought them here, the tragedy that had seemed like an ending but had actually been a beginning. She remembered the fear and grief of that night, standing alone as flames consumed her past. But she also remembered the quiet strength of the man who had appeared in her darkest hour, offering not just shelter but the foundation for a new life. From those ashes, they had built something beautiful, a home, a family, a legacy that would live on in their children and in the land they had nurtured together. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined on her own. As they approached their home, lights glowing warmly in the windows and their children's faces appearing eagerly at the door, Abigail felt a deep contentment settle in her soul. This was what it meant to truly live, to face loss with courage, to rebuild with hope, and to love with the whole heart. Ethan helped her down from the buggy, his hand lingering on hers as it had that very first night when he'd offered shelter to a neighbor in need. Their eyes met in the twilight, and no words were necessary. Everything that needed saying lived in the life they had created together, in the love that had transformed them both, from ashes to abundance, from strangers to soulmates, from a single act of kindness to a lifetime of love. Emmer rushed out to meet them, followed by James and Grace, their excited voices filling the evening air with questions about their day and demands for attention. Laughing, Abigail and Ethan allowed themselves to be pulled into the warm embrace of their family and the home they had built together, not just with logs and nails, but with courage, commitment, and an abiding love that had proven stronger than any fire. As they crossed the threshold together, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced everything else, side by side, building something beautiful from whatever life presented them. For that was the truest magic of their love story. Not that they had found each other amid the ashes of tragedy, but that they continued to choose each other, day after day, building a life of meaning and joy from the raw materials of ordinary moments and extraordinary commitment. In the years that followed, they would face droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations and family crises. They would celebrate their children's achievements and comfort them through disappointments. They would welcome grandchildren and bid farewell to old friends. Through it all, the foundation they had built would hold firm, a testament to what can grow when love takes root in even the most barren soil. And on quiet evenings, they would still sometimes visit the cabin where their journey together had begun, sitting on the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in colors reminiscent of both fire and promise, remembering how from the darkest night of Abigail's life had come the brightest dawn of their shared future.